A letter from my grandmother that changed my life. A scratching sound woke me in the middle of the night. Sharp, metallic scraping, like someone clawing at wood. I lay in my grandmother Ellen's bed, in the house that had been empty for 6 months since her death, listening to the silence of the old Victorian mansion in Salem Heights. After my painful breakup with Jason, I needed to be alone, far from Portland, from memories, from the pitying looks of friends. My parents couldn't decide what to do with Grandma's house, sell it, or move there for retirement. I volunteered to spend a 2-week vacation here to help with the decision and figure out what I wanted from life. This was my 3rd night in the house, and the first time I'd heard this strange sound. The scratching came again, more distinct now. It was coming from the nightstand to the right of the bed. I turned on the lamp with trembling fingers and carefully pulled out the drawer. Inside were ordinary things: Grandma's glasses, old medications, a notebook with phone numbers, several pens. The sound was coming from below, from the nightstand itself. I got on my knees and looked under the bottom of the drawer. A large insect was scurrying around. A wood-boring beetle, methodically chewing through the wood. But when I tried to get it out, my fingers hit something strange. The bottom of the drawer was uneven, as if it consisted of 2 parts. My heart began beating faster. I found an almost invisible crack along the edge and carefully pried it with my fingernail. The secret compartment opened with a quiet click, and inside lay a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma's familiar handwriting. The envelope was old, yellowed with time, but the red wax seal was intact. In beautiful script it read, "For Sarah, open only in case of extreme necessity." What could be an extreme necessity for a letter written by my dead grandmother? And why had she hidden it so carefully? I broke the seal with trembling fingers, feeling like an archaeologist opening an ancient tomb. Inside were several sheets of thin paper covered in the same neat handwriting that Grandma used to sign my childhood cards and write down recipes. The letter was dated March of last year, a month before her death. My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, fate has brought you to this house for a reason. Many years ago, when you were still very young, I met an old gypsy woman at a fair in Portland. She looked at you and told me something that haunted me all these years. She predicted that when you grew up, you would meet a man from the Hayward family and repeat my fate. I hoped the old woman was wrong, that it was just superstition. But fortune tellers of that kind are rarely wrong, especially when it comes to family curses. If you've already met him, run. Run as far as you can. This family has brought our bloodline nothing but grief and broken hearts. Don't let history repeat itself. Some mistakes cost too much, not just for us, but for our children. I pray to God that you'll never have to make the choice I once had to make. But if that moment comes, remember my words. Your loving grandmother, Ellen Hayward. The name meant nothing to me. In my 32 years, I'd never met anyone with that surname. Maybe the gypsy's prediction hadn't come true, or hadn't come true yet. I reread the letter several times, trying to understand what fate Grandma had repeated and what exactly she was so afraid of. But there were no specific details in the message, only mysterious warnings and mentions of a family curse. The next morning, I decided to search the house for additional information. Maybe Grandma had left other notes or documents that would shed light on the Hayward family history. I spent the whole day searching rooms. In the living room on the bookshelves, I found several old family albums. Leafing through yellowed pages, I studied photographs of relatives from different generations. Some photos were labeled and among the names I caught glimpses of Hayward. But these were photographs from the early last century, people in old-fashioned clothes against the backdrop of wooden houses. On one photograph from the 1920s, a group of young people was pictured at a picnic. Among the captions I read, James Carter, Ellen Carter, Thomas Hayward, Maria Wilson. Carter, Grandma's maiden name. So our families really did know each other once. But this information wasn't enough to understand what the problem was between the families. In the attic, among dusty boxes of Christmas decorations and old clothes, I discovered a wooden trunk with brass locks. The locks weren't fastened, and inside lay documents, birth, marriage, and death certificates, old letters, tax payment receipts. Among the documents was Grandpa's employment contract with a local construction company, dated 1945. The company owner was listed as one William Hayward, another trace of the Hayward family in my ancestors' history. But even this explained little. By the end of the week in Salem Heights, I'd gathered some scattered facts, but couldn't piece them into a complete picture. It was obvious that the Carter and Hayward families had intersected over decades, but the nature of their relationship remained a mystery. When my vacation ended, I returned to Portland with a light heart, but with thoughts constantly returning to Grandma's letter. The time away from the city had helped heal the wounds from my breakup with Jason. I was ready to start a new life, meet new people, maybe even fall in love again. How wrong I was to think I could control my destiny. A week after returning, my friend Lisa dragged me to a charity event at the Portland Art Museum. The event was dedicated to raising funds for restoring the city's historic buildings. Lisa insisted I needed to get out and meet new people, that staying home only made post-breakup depression worse. In the museum's main hall was an exhibition devoted to Victorian architecture. Antique blueprints, photographs of buildings, house models, it all reminded me of Grandma's house and the week I'd spent there. At one of the displays with blueprints stood a tall man with dark hair. He was carefully studying architectural plans of a late 19th century mansion, occasionally writing something in a notebook. Something about his appearance seemed familiar, though I was sure I'd never seen him before. He noticed my interest and turned around. He had gray eyes and a pleasant smile. He nodded toward the blueprints and said this house was a beautiful example of Victorian architecture, but with some unusual structural solutions for that time. I asked if he was an architect, and he confirmed. He said he specialized in restoring historic buildings, that it had been his passion since childhood. He had a pleasant, slightly husky voice and a rare ability to explain complex technical things in simple, understandable words. We talked all evening. I told him about Grandma's house, which the family couldn't decide whether to sell. He asked with interest about details, when the house was built, what the layout features were, what condition it was in. It turned out he knew Salem Heights well and had even worked on restoring several buildings in that area. When the evening was coming to an end, he suggested meeting again, maybe even going to look at Grandma's house. He could give a professional assessment and advise whether it was worth selling or could be restored for permanent residence. At the end of the evening, he handed me his business card, Mark Hayward, Restoration Architect. Hayward. The world around me froze. Grandma's prediction. The letter with the warning. If you've already met him, run. I stood holding the card, feeling a cold wave wash over my spine. Mark noticed my reaction. My face probably became very pale. He asked if everything was all right, but I quickly pulled myself together. I said I just remembered urgent matters. I took the card and hurriedly said goodbye. I couldn't sleep all night. I lay in bed thinking about what to do. On one hand, Grandma's letter was a clear warning. On the other hand, Mark seemed like an incredibly pleasant person. In one evening, he'd made me forget the pain of my breakup, made me feel interesting and desirable. How could I run from someone who had made such an impression on me, based only on a mysterious letter and family superstitions? The next day, Mark called. He said he couldn't stop thinking about our conversation and invited me to lunch. I wanted to refuse, but hearing his voice, I realized I couldn't. We met in a small cafe in Portland's historic district. Mark looked even more attractive in daylight. He asked about my work as a graphic designer, told me about his projects. We turned out to have an incredible number of common interests. We both loved old movies, read the same authors, dreamed of traveling through Europe. Lunch turned into a long walk through evening Portland. Mark showed me buildings he'd worked on restoring, told me their history. He spoke with such passion about architecture that I couldn't help but be infected by his enthusiasm. I didn't mention Grandma's warning at all. What was the point of spoiling a beautiful evening with mysterious family stories? We began meeting every day. Mark turned out to be exactly the man I'd always dreamed of. Smart, kind, with a wonderful sense of humor, and an incredible ability to listen. He was interested in my opinion, remembered small details of our conversations, gave little gifts just because, after a month of dating, I realized I was falling in love. And this scared me more than it made me happy, because Grandma's letter haunted me. Every time Mark kissed me goodbye or took my hand, I remembered the warning, run as far as you can. But how can you run from someone who makes you happy? After a month and a half of dating, Mark invited me to his house for dinner. His house turned out to be a stunning Victorian mansion in Portland's historic district. Mark had bought it in a semi-ruined state and had been restoring it for the last 3 years. Every detail was executed with impeccable taste and knowledge of the historical features of the era. Original stained glass, restored molding, parquet floors restored with jeweler's precision. While we dined by candlelight in the dining room with antique furniture, Mark told me more about his family and how he came to the restoration profession. The Haywards had lived in Salem Heights for more than a century. Mark's great-grandfather, Thomas, was one of the town's founders. His grandfather, William, became a builder and constructed houses throughout the county in the 1940s to 50s. His father continued the family business, but moved to Portland, where there were more opportunities for business development. Mark grew up among blueprints and construction tools. From childhood, he helped his father at construction sites, learned to distinguish wood types and stone varieties, but he was more interested in old buildings than new construction. He dreamed not of building new things, but of restoring the past. When I mentioned that my grandmother had also lived in Salem Heights all her life, Mark's expression changed slightly. He asked what Grandma's name was. Ellen Miller, I answered. Maiden name Carter. Mark was silent for a long time, obviously thinking about something. Then he said he'd heard the Carter surname from his grandfather William. Not once, actually. Grandpa sometimes mentioned this family, but always somehow strangely, with some special intonation. I asked what exactly he said about the Carters. Mark shrugged. He said Grandpa had died 5 years ago, and most of his stories about the past were fragmentary, often contradictory. Elderly memories aren't always accurate. But it seemed there had been some complicated relationship between the Carter and Hayward families. What exactly? Mark didn't know. Grandpa never told details, only sometimes said it was an old story better forgotten. But I couldn't forget. Every day with Mark was beautiful, but the shadow of Grandma's mourning constantly hung over me. This family has brought our bloodline nothing but grief and broken hearts. What terrible thing had happened between our families that Grandma felt it necessary to warn her granddaughter about it decades later? After 3 months of dating, I decided to learn the truth. If I was going to link my life with Mark, and that's what I was thinking about more and more, then I had to understand what I was dealing with. The trip to Salem Heights took the whole weekend. I told Mark I was going to check on Grandma's house and make a final decision about selling it. This was true, but not the whole truth. Saturday morning, I went to the local library. The librarian, an elderly woman named Dolores Campbell, had worked there for 40 years and was a real encyclopedia of local history. When I explained that I was studying family genealogy and was interested in connections between the Carters and Haywards, her eyes came alive. She readily led me to the archive section and showed me back issues of the local newspaper, Salem Heights Chronicle, for the last 100 years. The first mention of conflict between the families I found in the issue from September 15th, 1924. A small item in the crime section reported the death of James Carter as a result of an accident during an argument with Thomas Hayward. Details weren't given, but it was noted that the participants in the incident had previously had disagreements about land matters. In the obituary section of the same issue was a lengthy memorial article about James Carter. From it, I learned that he was the owner of a small farm on the outskirts of town, married, had a younger sister, Ellen. Many townspeople attended the funeral, which indicated that James was a respected man. There were no mentions in the newspaper that his death was anything other than an accident. However, in the issue from September 22, 1924, a week after James's funeral, there was a notice about Ellen Carter's wedding to Robert Miller. The wedding took place in a narrow family circle, a phrase that in those times usually meant either mourning in the family or some other special circumstances. I was struck by how quickly Ellen married after her brother's death. Less than a week between the funeral and wedding. This was unusual even for those times. In the 1925 archives, I found a record of the birth of Ellen and Robert Miller's son, William Miller, my grandfather. The child was born in February 1925, meaning he was conceived around May 1924, even before James Carter's death. So far, nothing suspicious. A young woman gets married, quickly becomes pregnant, gives birth to a healthy child, an ordinary story for the 1920s. But when I continued studying the archives, the picture became more complicated. In the issue from October 3, 1924, there was a notice about Thomas Hayward's wedding to Mary Wilson, the daughter of the local bank owner. The wedding was described as the event of the year, a lavish ceremony, many guests, expensive gifts. It turned out that Thomas Hayward also married almost immediately after James Carter's death. Coincidence? Or something more? I asked Dolores to show me birth records for 1925. In July 1925, Thomas and Mary Hayward had a son, William, Mark's future grandfather. The child was born 9 months after the wedding, which was completely normal. But the situation with William Miller's birth was different. If he was born in February 1925 and his parents married in September 1924, then it turned out that only 5 months passed between the wedding and birth. For the 1920s, this meant only one thing: the bride was pregnant before the wedding. By Saturday evening, I had an approximate chronology of events from 1924 to 1925, but I still didn't understand how this related to Granla's warning. Family feuds over land disputes ending in tragic death. Such stories weren't rare in small towns of the early 20th century. Sunday, I decided to look for additional information in church archives. The local Methodist Church, the oldest religious institution in Salem Heights, kept records of baptisms, weddings, and funerals from 1890. Pastor James Riley, a man of about 60 with kind eyes and a gray beard, readily allowed me to study the archives. He was interested in the town's history himself and gladly helped researchers. In the 1924 wedding book, I found records of Ellen Carter's marriage to Robert Miller and Thomas Hayward's marriage to Mary Wilson. Both ceremonies were performed personally by Pastor Riley, the current pastor's grandfather. But in the baptism book, I discovered a strangeness that made me reconsider the entire story. William Miller, Ellen and Robert's son, was baptized not in February 1925 when he was born, but in August of the same year. A 6-month delay was unusual for religious families of that time. Moreover, the baptism record had a note made by the pastor's hand, baptized at the mother's special request after long deliberation and prayers. What could have made a young mother delay her child's baptism for so long? And what did the phrase about long deliberation mean? I asked Pastor Riley to explain this entry. He carefully studied the page and shook his head. He said his grandfather had died when he was still a child, and he knew very little about the details of those events. However, he remembered that some personal records were preserved among his grandfather's papers, something like a diary where the old pastor recorded the most important or unusual events in parish life. Pastor Riley offered to look at these records if they would help my research. We went up to the church attic, where the papers of previous pastors were kept in an old trunk. Among the yellowed documents was a thin notebook in leather binding, Pastor Ezra Riley's personal diary for 1924 to 1925. The entries were made in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. Most concerned routine church affairs, Sunday services, charity collections, church roof repairs. But some entries made me hold my breath. September 15th, 1924. Today, I buried James Carter. A young man died in a senseless quarrel over land. Thomas Hayward claims it was an accident, but I saw guilt in his eyes. I pray that the Lord will forgive him this sin. September 22nd, 1924, married Ellen Carter to Robert Miller. The bride was pale and sad, which is understandable after the recent loss of her brother. But something in her behavior troubles me, as if she carries some secret pain. October 3rd, 1924. Married Thomas Hayward to Mary Wilson. A lavish wedding, many guests. But the groom seemed distracted. I saw him several times searching for someone among those present with his eyes. The bride is joyful and suspects nothing. February 15th, 1925. Ellen and Robert Miller had a son. Robert is happy, but Ellen asked me not to rush the baptism. She said she wanted to wait until she was sure it was right. A strange request for a pious woman. July 20th, 1925. Thomas and Mary Hayward had a son, a healthy boy very similar to his father. Thomas was unusually excited, constantly asking about the child's and mother's health. August 12, 1925, finally baptized the miller's son. Ellen spoke with me at length before the ceremony. She talked about the sins of fathers that fall on children, about secrets better taken to the grave. I didn't understand what she was talking about, but I gave her absolution and baptized the boy with a prayer that the Lord would protect him from the burden of the past. December 25, 1925. Both young families attended the Christmas service, the Millers and Haywards. Ellen and Thomas carefully avoided looking at each other, but I noticed how Thomas stole glances at little William Miller. There was such longing in his gaze that it made me uneasy. January 10, 1926. Ellen Miller came to me for confession. She told me a story that made my skin crawl. It turns out that after her father's death, her mother confessed a terrible secret to her. The man Ellen had considered her father all her life was not her real father, but her stepfather. Her real father was from the Hayward family, her mother's second cousin. The mother hid this by marrying another man who agreed to raise someone else's child. It turns out Ellen and Thomas Hayward are not just lovers, but third cousins. The mother told her, "The history of our two families always repeats itself. Every generation makes the same mistakes." Ellen is horrified that she gave birth to a child by her third cousin, afraid of the family curse. I closed the diary with trembling hands. The picture was beginning to clear, and what I saw explained Grandma's fears. Not only was there a forbidden connection between Ellen Carter and Thomas Hayward, but Ellen's real father was also from the Hayward family. The family curse was passed down from generation to generation. But I still lacked key details. I asked Pastor Riley to show me confession records, if they were preserved. He explained that confessions weren't recorded in full. That would violate the secrecy of the sacrament. But his grandfather sometimes made brief notes about parishioners' spiritual problems to better help them. In a separate notebook, I found an entry dated January 15, 1926. Confession of E.M. The sin of fathers truly lies on children. Her parents, second cousins Robert Carter and Maria Carter, née Hayward. Secret marriage, 1899. Families were against it because of close kinship. The curse continues. E fell in love with T.H., not knowing they were third cousins. The child is the fruit of forbidden love and family sin. I reread the entry several times, trying to comprehend the revealed truth. Ellen Carter's parents were second cousins. Moreover, Ellen's mother was born a Hayward. This meant that Ellen Carter and Thomas Hayward were third cousins to each other. They fell in love, not knowing about their family connections. Their romance led to the birth of a child, my grandfather. But if my grandfather was Thomas Hayward's son, and Mark's grandfather was also from the Haywards? No, that was impossible. The records showed that Thomas and Mary Hayward had a son, William, born in July 1925. I carefully reread all the dates. Thomas Hayward married Mary Wilson in October 1924. Their son William was born in July 1925, exactly 9 months after the wedding. And William Miller, Ellen's son, was born in February 1925. Counting back, he was conceived in May 1924, 5 months before Thomas's marriage to Mary. It turned out that Thomas Hayward had 2 sons by different women just months apart. One by his secret lover Ellen, the other by his legal wife Mary. My grandfather and Mark's grandfather were half brothers, and this meant that Mark and I were second cousins. Returning to Portland, I couldn't decide for several days whether to tell Mark about my discovery. How do you explain to someone that you are related, that your love is a repetition of family history that had already led to tragedy? Mark noticed that I'd started acting strangely. He asked if something had happened on the trip. I answered evasively, citing fatigue and work. But keeping silent was unbearable. A week after returning, I decided to tell him everything. We met in the same cafe where we'd had our first dinner. Mark was in a great mood. He'd just gotten a contract to restore a historic mansion in downtown Portland. I started with Grandma's letter. I showed him the yellowed sheet with the warning and told him how I'd found it in the hiding place. Mark carefully read the letter, frowning more with each line. When he finished, he was silent for a long time. Then I told him the whole story I'd managed to reconstruct, about the love between Ellen Carter and Thomas Hayward, about them being third cousins, about James's death, about the secret of our grandfather's origins, about the family curse passed down from generation to generation. Mark listened without interrupting. His face became increasingly grim. When I finished, he said he'd never heard anything like this from his relatives. A completely different version of events was passed down in the Hayward family. According to them, Thomas Hayward was forced to kill James Carter in self-defense. James attacked him with a knife, demanding money for land. Thomas defended himself and accidentally dealt a fatal blow. As for the romance with Ellen Carter, the family said it was the girl's one-sided infatuation. She pursued Thomas, trying to break up his engagement, even made up a story about pregnancy to force him to marry her. When this plan didn't work, her brother decided to achieve justice by force. The result was tragedy. I asked Mark if he believed this version. He shrugged, said he didn't know who to believe. Too much time had passed, witnesses had died, and documents could be interpreted differently. I suggested telling his parents everything. Let them decide what to do with this information. Mark agreed, though reluctantly. The next day, we went to his parents' house in Portland's suburbs. David and Margaret Hayward greeted us warmly. They already knew about our relationship and seemed to approve of my choice. Over dinner, I told them the same story I'd told Mark. I showed them copies of documents I'd made in the archives, read excerpts from the pastor's diary. The reaction was exactly what I expected. David turned pale. He said it was impossible, that his grandfather could never have committed murder, that this whole story was malicious slander from the Carter family that they'd been spreading for 100 years. Margaret was more restrained, but no less categorical. She declared that even if there had been some romances between the families in the past, this couldn't be proof of kinship. People lie, documents are forged, and memories distort over time. David got up from the table and said there was only one way to establish the truth: a genetic test. If our families were really connected by blood relationship, then DNA analysis would show it. If not, then this whole story was fiction. He was ready to pay for the most accurate test at the city's best laboratory. Let science put an end to these disputes. Margaret supported her husband. She added that they couldn't allow some old gossip to affect their son's happiness. Mark looked at me questioningly. I agreed to the test. Deep down, I hoped that the family legend would turn out to be fiction, and Mark and I could build a relationship without the shadow of the past. The results were supposed to come in 3 weeks. These 3 weeks were among the most difficult in my life. Mark and I continued dating, but tension hung between us. He tried to behave as usual, but I could see he was tormented by doubts. Mark's parents also changed. They remained polite to me, but coldness was felt in every word, especially Margaret. She clearly blamed me for bringing this story into their family. Finally, the day came to receive the results. We met at the genetic laboratory office. Mark, his parents, and I. The consultant, a young woman in a white coat, explained the test results to us. Mark and I indeed had common DNA segments, characteristic of second cousins. The probability of random coincidence was less than 1%. This meant we had a common grandfather. David and Margaret sat silently, digesting the information. Finally, David asked what this meant for Mark and me. The consultant explained that genetically, our relationship posed no danger to offspring. In many cultures, marriages between second cousins are considered normal. But the decision remained ours. Leaving the laboratory, we walked silently down the street for a long time. Mark's parents left first, saying they needed time to think. Mark stopped near a park and said he also needed time to comprehend the situation. I understood his condition. For him, this was no less a shock than for me. In a few weeks, the entire family history he'd known since childhood had collapsed. We agreed not to meet for a week, so each of us could make a decision alone. This week was agonizing. I wavered between hope and despair. On one hand, the genetic test confirmed we were related, but not so closely as to be unacceptable. On the other hand, the family history was so traumatic it could scare away any reasonable person. Mark called after 10 days. He said his parents demanded a meeting. They'd made a decision and wanted to discuss it with me. I came to the Hayward house with a heavy heart, prepared for the worst. David and Margaret met me in the living room. Their faces were stern but determined. David began by saying they had studied all the documents I'd provided and conducted their own investigation of family history. The result confirmed my version of events. His grandfather, Thomas, really was guilty of James Carter's death. The Hayward family had been hiding the truth all this time, presenting themselves as victims rather than perpetrators of the tragedy. Margaret added that the genetic test left no doubt about our relationship. However painful it was to admit, Mark and I were indeed second cousins. Then David said what I least expected. They weren't against our relationship. Yes, it was an unusual situation. Yes, some people might condemn us. But times had changed, and what was unacceptable 100 years ago could be normal today. The main thing was that Mark and I loved each other. And family connections only confirmed that there was deep compatibility between us. Margaret nodded. She said she'd studied the issue and learned that marriages between second cousins were allowed in most states, including Oregon. The genetic risk for children was minimal. If we were prepared to deal with possible social condemnation, then the Hayward family would support us. I was amazed by their reaction. I asked where Mark was and what he thought about all this. David smiled and said Mark was waiting for me in the garden. He wanted to talk to me alone. I went out to the garden through the living room's French doors. Mark stood by a rose bush, holding a small box in his hands. He came up to me and said the last 2 weeks had been the most difficult in his life. He'd thought about our families, about the past, about the future, about what was right and what was wrong. And he'd concluded that love was more important than prejudices. Yes, our great-great-grandfathers and great-grandmother had made mistakes. Yes, Family history was full of pain and tragedy. But we weren't our ancestors. We could write our own story. He got down on one knee and opened the box. Inside lay a simple but beautiful ring with a small diamond. Mark asked me to marry him. I cried when I said yes. I cried from happiness, from relief, from realizing that our love had turned out to be stronger than family curses. But the story didn't end there. A month after the engagement, I realized I was pregnant. The news both delighted and frightened me. On one hand, I'd always dreamed of children. On the other hand, memories of the family curse haunted me. I told Mark about the pregnancy, and he was thrilled. We immediately signed up with a geneticist to make sure that close kinship wouldn't affect the child's health. The doctor reassured us. The risk of genetic abnormalities in marriages between second cousins was only a few % higher than normal. With modern medical levels, this wasn't considered a significant threat. My son was born on a cool April morning, a healthy, beautiful boy with dark hair and gray eyes. Resembling both me and Mark, we named him William, in honor of both our grandfathers, whose complex history had led to our birth. 2 years have passed. Little Willie is growing up as a cheerful and curious child. He has no genetic abnormalities. Tests showed he's completely healthy. Recently, something happened that finally convinced me we'd made the right decision. Walking through downtown Portland with little Willie in his stroller, I stopped at a children's store window. Around me was the usual crowd of shoppers and passers-by. Suddenly, someone's hand touched my shoulder. I turned around and saw an elderly woman with penetrating dark eyes. Something about her appearance seemed familiar, though I was sure I'd never seen her before. The woman took my hand and said in a strange, hypnotic voice, "You're the only one in your family who listened to your heart, not fear. Your great-great-grandmother chose secrecy. Your grandmother chose fear. You chose love and truth. The curse is broken forever." I tried to ask who she was, but the woman released my hand, leaned over the stroller, and whispered quietly, "This little one will be the first in your bloodline to grow up free from family secrets and fears." When I blinked, the woman had already dissolved into the crowd. I looked around, trying to find her, but among dozens of people, there was no one similar. Only the light scent of old roses reminded me of the strange encounter. We live in Grandma's house in Salem Heights, which Mark restored with love and attention to every detail. In the living room hang portraits of our ancestors, all generations, including Ellen Carter and Thomas Hayward. The story that began with tragedy and continued with suffering finally got a happy ending. Recently, I reread Grandma's letter again. Now I understand that she wasn't afraid of the Haywards themselves, but of repeating her mistakes. She chose fear instead of love, secrecy instead of openness, flight instead of fighting. But each generation learns from the mistakes of the previous one. My great-great-grandmother Ellen loved and lost because of family prejudices. Grandma loved and suffered because of family secrets. I loved and chose truth. The scratching of a beetle in an old nightstand led me to a letter that was supposed to destroy my love. But instead it helped me understand that true love isn't afraid of truth. Grandma's letter warned me about meeting the Hayward family, but it didn't foresee that sometimes the most frightening path leads to the most beautiful ending. Family curses exist only as long as we believe in them. And love is stronger than any prejudices. even those passed down through centuries.